Okay, as we begin our Aboriginal watershed lesson, I want you to look at the art and listen to the story of the Aborigines. And I want you to also make a connection between the artwork, the people who created the art, and our Pacific Northwest Native study, because this all kind of ties together. You're going to see some common themes, some different themes. You're also going to notice the art. We're going to be talking about watersheds, water, and weather. Look at the art and look at the scenery and the pictures and think about how that is going to connect to our current unit. So the story of Aboriginal art. Aboriginal culture dates back as far as between 60,000 to 80,000 years. This is when Aborigines first settled in Australia. They are the natives to Australia. The first evidence of or Aboriginal ethos or philosophy means way of thinking is evident in the still visible rock art, which dates back more than 20,000 years. Ochres were used to paint on the rocks, and ochres are different colors in the yellow color family. Archaeologists have been able to date remains and findings as far back as 40,000 to 60,000 years from discoveries of primal campsites. There is no written language for the Australian Aboriginal people. So in order to convey their important cultural stories through the generations, it is portrayed by symbols or icons through their artwork. That sounds vaguely familiar. It's imperative, which means important, to pass on information to preserve their culture. The Indigenous art is centered on storytelling. It is used as a chronicle way to convey knowledge of the land, events, and beliefs of the Aboriginal people. The use of symbols is an alternate way to writing down stories of cultural significance, teaching survival, and the use of the land. The interpretations differ depending on the audience, just like the Pacific Northwest tribes. When being told to children, it would take on a simpler form, highlighting the educational and behavioral aspect. There can be a combination of information and moral teachings behind the story. The children are taught right from wrong and the consequences of good and bad behavior. The stories, however, would be interpreted at a very different and higher level form when teaching to initiated elders. That is similar to our Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 vocabulary. As you're going on in your education, those words are different at different levels. And here's a picture of symbols and what those symbols are based on the drawing, what each one means. I love the spears, the shield, the boomerang, the hunting boomerang, a meeting place where people come together, kangaroo tracks. Very interesting. Although Australian Aboriginals have been using ochres as body paint on bark and rocks for tens of thousands of years, it was not until the 1930s that the first paintings were done. These were not done in ochre or in dot art, but in watercolor at the Hermansburg Mission near Alice Springs in Australia. The illustrated desert landscapes. The first exhibition was in 1937 by the most famous of the first Aboriginal watercolor painters, Albert Namatjira. His exhibition was held in Adelaide. Below are several of the artworks and a collage of images. And an exhibition is a show. What do you see? What do you see in the rock formations? It's interesting. Up until the early 1970s, artists mainly used watercolors. Ochre and bark paintings were starting to become available to non-Indigenous admirers. Indigenous, remember, means people from that land. And at Ernabella Mission in 1948, an art and craft center was founded. Traditionally, paintings by Aboriginals were drawn on rock walls. Ceremonial articles as body paint, and most significantly, drawn in dirt or sand together with songs or stories. Artwork we see today on canvas and board commenced nearly 50 years ago. And here's them celebrating. In 1971, a school teacher named Jeffrey Barden was working with Aboriginal children in Papauna near Alice Springs. He noticed whilst the Aboriginal men were telling stories, they would draw symbols in the sand. He encouraged them to paint the stories onto canvas and board. This began the famous Aboriginal art movement. It was a major jump for Aboriginal people to start painting their stories into Western facades, which was a very foreign concept to them. Since the Australian Aboriginal art has been identified as the most exciting contemporary art form of the 20th century, Aboriginal artists need permission to paint particular stories. They inherit the rights to these stories, which are passed down through generations within certain skin groups. An Aboriginal artist cannot paint a story that does not belong to them through family. It would be similar to your family having a story that you've told down the line, and your neighbor asking, can I tell the story of your family? And you saying yes or no. If they're not related to you, then they would have to ask permission to tell that story. This is the ancient story of the Milky Way and the Seven Sisters. This dreaming was inherited by Gabriella from her mother, handed down to her from her paternal grandmother. So this is a story that was given to her. This is another art handed down through the family. Earth images. Creation law is the heart of Aboriginal culture and consequently for Aboriginal art. It sets down the dreaming, which provides the identity for Aboriginal people and their association or link to the land. Dreamtime, or Jakurpa, and Tingari, the term varies according to the particular language, is the translation of the creation of time for the Aboriginal people. Most Aboriginal artists paint facets of their dreaming, which forms a share of their inheritance and identity. Many people believe that dots were used to hide information from white men when the Aboriginal people became afraid that they would be able to see and understand their sacred private knowledge. The dots were used to obscure the secret symbols or iconography underneath. Aboriginal art differs in character and style depending which region the artist is from and what language is spoken. Most contemporary art can be recognized from the community where it was created. The use for ochre paints is marked in Arnhem Land and East Kimberley. Materials or colors used for Aboriginal art was originally obtained from the local land. Ochre or iron clay pigments were used to produce colors such as white, yellow, red, black from charcoal. Other colors were soon added, such as smoky grays, sage greens, and saltbush mauves. During the mid-1980s, with more Aboriginal women artists appeared on the scene, and a wider range of modern colors were chosen and bright desert paintings started to arrive on the market. Choice of colors continued to identify the styles of the communities, the styles varying dramatically even within regions. And there is certainly no hard rule here, as can be seen with many of the artworks. And here are some examples of the artworks. Some of these seen, and look at how expensive. They go for quite a bit of money. And I want to go back to the page that we were on. This will just take a second to get back. Sorry about that. And we did our warm up and we're moving on. Here's more. Some of these paintings have sold for $1 million. Aboriginal art is equally at home in both galleries and museums. The Australian Aboriginal is arguably the most successful and certainly longest surviving culture in human history. It's complex and focused on long-term survival in the most hostile of environments. It has deep knowledge, spiritual culture, and practical survival teachings. The art reflects the earliest period of the ancient culture in both artistic and anthropological merit. Anthropology is the study of a society or history. This is one of the reasons it's so special and important. Contemporary Aboriginal art has been an incentive for remote Aboriginal communities in many places, being the only business communities have. Here's some of the art, and here they are making the art. So as you looked at that art, what did you see? What kind of shapes and movement did you see? What did it remind you of as we looked at the art? Be ready to share your thoughts.